Hi, everybody. My name's Mitalian Conde, and I am joining you from New York City in the United States. And it's my pleasure this morning to be part of this fireside chat with Rashad Robinson, president of Color of Change. I am the founding CEO of a nonprofit called AI for the People. And our mission is to increase the representation of Black technologists within the public interest sector by 2030. And we do that through a variety of ways, including high-level consultations. We work with journalists and filmmakers and other creative professionals to really advance this idea that tech is not neutral. And in actual fact, tech is in many cases anti-Black. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Rashad and really kick us off to what I hope is going to be an inspiring and, as much as we can make it, fun conversation, but one that really looks at technology through that angle. So my first question to you, Rashad, is really about the entry point in which you came to this. I've made films about science and technology since 1998, but it really wasn't until 2012 when George Zimmerman surveilled Trayvon Martin that I began to become interested in technology. And that's because in my prior life as a documentary filmmaker, I had read about reports of facial recognition tests like the one in 2002 for the Super Bowl, and really, quite frankly, thought it was nonsense. Really thought, this would never happen. This is science fiction. And it wasn't until I really leaned into the coding movement as a parent. I have two young boys, and then I started to work opposite Google, that I realized that this might impact them in a negative way. Could you let us know a little bit about how Color of Change, first of all, started? I think that's really interesting, but how you got to this tech accountability.
So great. First of all, it's great to be with you. It's great to be with all of you at RightsCon. I'm sad that we can't be together, but in so many ways, the crisis that we are in the middle of, which has in so many ways exposed all different aspects of systemic racism, has allowed me to go to a lot more places than I would have to go otherwise if I had to get on a plane. And so I'm joining you from Eastern Long Island right now. And want to talk a little bit about Color of Change and how we found it, and sort of respond to the question around our founding is, we were founded in the aftermath of a flood, which was Hurricane Katrina about 15 years ago now. It was started by bad decision makers and turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. Black people were on their roofs begging for the government to do something, and they were left to die. And the thing that's important, I think, about Katrina that gets to sort of how we think about our theory of change across all sectors of our work, but also how we think about technology, is that at the end of the day, like, Katrina illustrated things that people already knew: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, the ways in which structural racism undergirds all of those things. And at the heart of Katrina, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. And when institutions are not nervous about disappointing your community, it doesn't matter what kind of research report you have that illustrates all the facts and figures. It doesn't matter what you do in the courts if you don't have the power to implement it. It doesn't matter what you build in Silicon Valley because you can't sort of code your way out of systemic racism. And so part of the sort of theory of change, of Color of Change, was how do we channel the presence that Black people have in the world, the visibility, the awareness, into the power to actually change the rules, to force those in power to be nervous about disappointing us. And that goes across Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Wall Street, Capitol Hills, both in states and federally, and so many other sort of aspects of life that impacts Black people and aspects of power. And so, from the very beginning, as an organization that started with a single email to about 1,000 people, inviting them to join this movement, we very much have sort of relied on and believed in the power of an open internet, and fought very hard around net neutrality reality, to protect it, not just sort of as a sort of theoretical human rights issue, not as an actual practical human rights issue, but as a civil rights issue with a very specific context here in the United States about the ability of people to be heard, counted, and visible, regardless of whether they're privileged or vulnerable, majority or minority, or in favor or out of favor with those who are in power. But we got to sort of this technology work, this work around policing, surveillance, tech, from the very early pieces, because we've always had a real focus on corporate accountability, on sort of the ability to be free inside of a democracy, ability to be treated equal. And so whether it was dealing with issues of things like stingrays that were put out side of protests, which were capturing sort of unlawfully all sorts of sort of conversations and surveilling movements of Black activists, to sort of the ways in which we were being doxxed on platforms and not and those platforms not being held accountable, to facial recognition. At each phase, these sort of issues sit at the intersection of sort of our rights inside of a democracy, corporate power and the relationship to corporations, and sort of the sort of day-to-day sort of rules, whether they be policy or whether they be unwritten rules that impact Black people's lives. And so technology has been a through line, and a real through line from the very beginning, which was Hurricane Katrina, which in so many ways animated all of the ways in which like disinvestment, targeting, exploitation of Black people sort of puts us in harm's way. And out of that, building a powerful infrastructure that could hold those who made those decisions accountable and create a new set of rules for how they have to do business.
All of that, I agree with all of that. And where I would really like to start this conversation is not with advanced technological systems, even though I would like us to get there later on in the context of policing, but more about this idea that there were 1,000 people that you sent this email and you somehow had to capture that imagination. I remember working at the BBC in 2005 and seeing those pictures and really wondering, you know, what was wrong with the United States. I think people from outside of the States think anti-Black racism is something that's unique to this country. And of course, we know, being at RightsCon, that that's really not the case. So where I want to get to is some of the strategies that the Color of Change have used in policing specifically to capture our imagination around policing, and how we're using media and popular culture to change our views of policing, and then kind of lead into more specifically about your work in that area.
So yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work in Hollywood, and you know, one reason why that is so important is because the cultural images and the stories end up shaping the reality that people have about the system. And so for the last 20 years in this country, violent crime has basically steadily went down. According to Pew Research and others, Americans believe violent crime is going up. And so we have a gap between perception and reality that is deeply fueled by a whole set of incentive structures that happen on our sort of corporate media airwaves. We recently published a report in January called Normalizing Injustice, which looked at the crime procedural, the crime TV shows, the scripted shows like Law and Order and CSI and others, and sort of their representation of race and their representation of crime. As it related to sort of the role of technology, these shows do actually a tremendous disservice day in and day out of normalizing the type of illegal, unconstitutional surveillance, almost creating a world where the ends justify the means, that they're gonna violate someone's First Amendment rights, but they caught the bad guy, and so everyone was kept safe. These shows are supported sort of on the back end by all sorts of sort of law enforcement and intelligence experts who end up being paid consultants on these shows. These shows then reach millions upon millions of people. So, right, undoing the kind of day in, day out context of these shows with an op-ed piece or a documentary is almost untenable, because what we've done is we've created a world in which people see privacy, fundamentals of our sort of data security and our sort of our kind of daily movements being violated, but they see it dramatized in ways up against a sort of threat that makes it seem like it's okay to violate those rights because people are being kept safe, and then maybe the rights that are there are sort of inconvenient to the sort of larger threat of violence from a sort of Black or brown or sort of foreign force, and we can throw our Constitution out the window. And part of what we've been doing is working to push back against those shows, working to create sort of a new sort of understanding, a new sort of kind of system of how these shows tell stories.
And so now that we're in this mess. So for example, until I read your report, I would have said one of my favorite shows was Law and Order SVU or SUV. I don't know. But then ultimately, ultimately I'm thinking this is actually a terrible show that is about sexual crime, and maybe I need a therapist and maybe I need to examine myself. But the reason I'm so interested in that is in this moment where policing, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, which is relatively short because Black people in the United States have fought against carceral control since, for 401 years. When Africans came to this country and were enslaved, they resisted, and that's the history on which that advocacy is built. But I'm really curious that as Color of Change was getting involved with conversations about defunding the police and conversations about reimagining the way that we think about public safety in response to the extrajudicial killing of George Floyd. And of course, since George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery has died, and even just prior to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, an African-American woman, had been killed in her own home, where the police went in like a cop-style raid. It sounded like TV, and assassinated this woman, and we're still waiting for justice on that. But I'm wondering, as Color of Change is doing some of this work around changing the way we think about police and changing the way we think about a technological police form, how did these images inform, and what strategies did you guys use to bring us back to the reality that crime is falling and we have fundamental rights that need to be protected, even if they're being abused by agents of the state?
Well, I think it's actually really important that we redefine what policing is, because I think that we've gotten this idea that where there is police, there is safety. And that's actually not the case. I mean, if the presence of a lot of policemen, a lot of safety, like folks would spend all their time feeling deeply safe in some of the poorest, most challenged communities where there are a lot of police. What ends up happening is that we substitute police in certain communities, particularly Black and brown communities, for the things that we know actually make communities whole, which is investment in economics, investment in schools, investment in healthcare, investment in the things that make communities fully safe. Where there are a lot of police, there ends up being a lot of police violence. And much like the conversation around guns, I don't believe that we can actually deal with gun violence with just a bunch of impotent gun laws. We actually have to remove guns. We have to downsize the number of guns. And so unless we are downsizing the number of police and actually right-sizing the investments in communities, we're not going to get to a new sense of safety and justice in our communities. And I think that sort of how I really think about it. This is sort of not just about how do we make the system work better. I hear people say that on AI. I hear people say that about policing. If we can just do better training, we can sort of make things sort of better. But, here's the thing. When I was in the final phases back in 2013 of getting Fox TV network to cancel the TV show Cops, it was a bit, 21st Century Fox, a big corporation with a sort of infamous leader. And, talking to their PR folks and their other folks who were going back and forth with us, we had kind of had them on the ropes around the campaign, and they offered to diversify the sort of communities they went in. And basically that was sort of code for, we won't go into as many Black communities, we'll go into poor white communities. Because they, and I told them, I was like, if you're saying that you're going to go into more poor white communities and that's going to make us feel better, then you've picked the wrong racial justice organization. Because unless you're going to film the TV show Cops on Capitol Hill or Wall Street, where actual crime happens at a deep structural level that we know hurts people in deep ways, and I'm not interested in you continuing to go into communities that are already under attack, that are already targeted. And so what I say about sort of all of this, right, work is that corporate power, that the sort of history of policing to protect corporations, to protect property, to protect the slave trade, all the way up to now, sort of in a corporate democracy, sort of the relationship between police and safety is one that I think we have to integrate, because police are not there to keep us safe. Police are here to keep control. And where that is the case, we can't just simply put laws around less chokeholds, because if someone's goal is to control you, then they're going to find another way to control you if you ban chokeholds. And so that's how we got to defund. And that is how it is always connected with technology, as we see our police become militarized, as we see them operating in some ways like they are sort of dealing with sort of foreign forces, because that's how Black people are oftentimes treated in our communities, as enemy combatants. And so part of this is really reshaping the resources that law enforcement has and right-sizing our vision around what safety looks like for all of us.
And so just on the back end of that, obviously I'm a technologist, I'm a nerd, I'm a geek. I'm really interested in, from your perspective, from like a rights organization, how have you seen technology being increasing, the changes in technology, the changes in technology in terms of the campaigns that you've done? So I opened this conversation saying my entry point into this work was through this vigilante killing, right? But this was a person surveilling a person. But as a professional, I did know that facial recognition was being used. I always say, I thought it was a joke. I thought technology was great. I thought that if we had an app, we would be able to we would be able to diversify the data set or somehow solve racism through a push notification. But clearly I was wrong. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is, as you've had to advocate for these different campaigns in terms of police, how have your tactics had to change to respond to the new technology? Because there probably wasn't a stingray, right, in 2005 with Katrina. So I'm fascinated about that.
So, this is really one of the biggest challenges of constantly trying to keep up inside of a marketplace where the incentives to fast track new policies, fast track new products is so deep. Racism is like water pouring over the floor that has holes in it. It will always find the cracks. It will always leak through. And so part of how I've tried to approach this is, while we have to deal with a lot of one-offs day to day with various companies, while we have to deal with one-offs with different municipalities as things are implemented, if we don't get strong federal standards around sort of how these companies are relating to technology and policing, then we're just going to continue to be in this game of whack-a-mole, that game at the carnival where something pops up and you hit it down and something else pops up. And while you're hitting that thing that's popped up, 5 other things have popped up. And so we are actually in a place where I feel like in order to keep up, we actually need standards. We need infrastructure in this country that can deal with it. The hearing today, where technology CEOs are going to Capitol Hill to testify on antitrust, is I think a perfect illustration of sort of all the ways in which so many of these companies that are at the sort of center of some of the challenges, from the sort of social media platform like Facebook to Amazon and the role in facial recognition, all of these companies that the sort of incentives around profit and growth will trample over civil rights, trample over any sort of beliefs in the sort of ability of everyday people, regardless of who they are, to be protected inside of a democracy. And so part of what we have to do is get to new standards. At the same time, we are dealing, because we don't have the political levers right now, we are dealing with sort of a set of strategies that have to be about exposing problems when they arise, working to channel corporate power and hold corporations accountable, working to where we can get rules implemented, working with those who are engaging in the courts. All of these things are sort of, things that we feel comfortable doing as long as we are building the bricks, building the house towards the type of long-term change that makes it so that we are not playing, we're not chasing various issues, but we're able to make sure that the systems we put in place are actually enforcing the problems as they arise.
So you've just made my morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're watching us from, because so much of my work, specifically around facial recognition, but also around information integrity, disinformation, and misinformation, originates in the work that I did in Congress, actually, as an advisor, and being part of that team that introduced the biometric barriers Act, which was the only one to be introduced to the US House of Representatives during this particular Congress, and as well as deepfakes accountability. But what we were asking for in all of those bills was this idea that we have the civil, not just the civil rights, but really the human rights, the constitutional rights that are laid out to American citizens are applied to these technologies as well. And one of the things that struck me in your response was, just last week, I was on a panel with the UN Special Rapporteur for Racism, Tendai Achume, who was in the opening ceremonies for RightsCon. And she's just released a report called Techno-Racism. And what that did was give a global perspective of how, in many ways, we think about the Uyghur in China in terms of facial recognition. And we also think about Black populations and false detection. I'm thinking specifically a case that the ACLU in Michigan currently have, where an African-American man was wrongfully arrested using facial recognition. They put his picture through a camera and misidentified him because they thought all Black people look alike. Hopefully all you guys in the audience can see I'm me and Rashad is him, and we are separate people. But he hadn't been at that store since 2014. And he could prove that he literally had not been in that place. And they're going to be able to use geolocation data on his phone to confirm. That's a very, very long way of me saying, me too, I agree with you. We do need standards. And I guess leading into my next question about movements, because I think AI for the People are very, very, very concerned about standards and stories and changing those, and then working with other organizations that are concerned with movement. And from our vantage point, we really credit the movement for Black Lives for providing a platform by which people could say, not just that Black Lives Matter, but then linking Black Lives Matter to the use of facial recognition in police, which ultimately then led to a bill that we were able to influence because we had already written the statute. That is an even longer way of me to ask, in terms of color of change, that 1,000 people is now 5 million people, I believe. I am one of them. I look out for your text. Tell me.
Yeah.
7 million people. I am one of them. I actually look for your texts to tell me what to do. And as soon as I'm not overprotecting my 13-year-old, I am going to introduce him to your text. So there's this generational, expectation that the way that we organize is through this particular organization. But how can that 7 million people who want to do right by Black people really be activated in this moment where we're seeing the movement of Black lives being a pressure too?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. First, we are obviously trying to electoralize this issue as best as possible, although it's complicated. We're trying to work this into the ways in which political leaders who are running for office from the very top of the ticket on down are sort of including these issues in terms of their platforms and their planks. And then we're also running this campaign called Beyond the Statement, which we're sort of in the early phases of, which is really about pushing these big companies across many sectors, from tech companies to Hollywood and elsewhere, to move beyond their sort of hashtag statement of support for Black lives to the sort of structural things that they will do, both internal and then external, with their go-to-market strategies, to really put some rigor and some accountability around statements of support for Black lives that don't coincide with the sort of behavior change or engagement change of the company. And so, that, right, for us means that we actually have to have people in motion. We have to have Black folks and allies of every race with us, part of our relationship, to mobilize folks in those moments. And if we have sort of those relationships, we can sort of be in a place where we can build more power and more engagement. The other thing I will say that I think is sort of related to all of this is that, and I kind of touched on it a second, but I want to hit a finer point around it. There is this way, especially around AI, that I sometimes hear people think oh, we'll just make the technology better. And if we make the technology better, then we will solve for the problems. And the thing I want to push back on is that even if we make the technology better, we have to think about how technology is applied over imbalances of power, right? And so even if you sort of in certain types of policing, let's say in New York, uptown New York, where I live a stone's throw away from Columbia University and a stone's throw away from Central Harlem. And although Columbia University is taking over sort of all of Harlem now, but the main Columbia campus. And so no one can tell me that there's not just as much drugs being done on Columbia University's campus as there is in Central Harlem. We know who gets arrested, who gets tracked, who gets harmed for it. And so I just say that to say that simply changing gun laws without changing policing doesn't actually get you to a better sort of lived experience. And that, I think, from a perspective of people who think about rights, right? When you overlay race, you can't just think about the written rules. You have to think about the unwritten rules. And you have to target your engagement around those things. And that, I think, has been the very sort of important piece of the Black Lives Matter movement, is a specificity around what does it mean to have racial justice at the center of your policymaking. And when you do, you're able to build policies that address not just the sort of written letter of the problem, but the actual lived experience of the problem.
Right. And I would just add to that. I didn't mean to amen as you were speaking, but I was catching the spirit, because I do completely agree with you. But we saw this in Ferguson, right? We saw that one of the major problems in Ferguson were the municipalities in St. Louis County were using police stops to fund public services. And when we looked at that data, we found that Black people were 11% more likely to be stopped than white motorists. And and if you couldn't pay your fine, you went to jail. And so that is an example of what we would think about as disparate impact, right? A police stop is a police stop. It's just that your taillight was broken. But then if you're targeting this particular group, not just in terms of criminalization, but there's this economic impact, then that to me is what I call the technology of anti-Blackness. So just to start to turn the conversation a little bit, because you have alluded to this, and it's one of the aspects of your work that I love and I hate at the same time, but it's so important. is your corporate strategies. So, I sit in my apartment in Brooklyn, and I'm like, why is he going to eat dinner with Mark Zuckerberg again? This is a a bloodbath. We need to come with guns. We need to come with. But luckily, I'm not you, and I don't have that access. And so you're more effective. But I'm wondering whether you can, without giving away all your secrets, kind of walk us through what that corporate accountability strategy looks like generally. Really let us know why it's important. I'm very famous for saying that racial justice equals economic justice. And until we have both, you are not helping Black people. And I'm on the record of saying that does include reparations for for descendants of enslaved people. I think that that's really important. And as you're walking us through, and this might be 9 questions instead of 1, but as you're walking us through, I really want us to get into stop the hate, because that's one of the major reasons I showed up. Like I'm overstretched and overtired and doing a lot of work, so I'm not really getting into the details of things. And I would love for you to just let me and the audience know more about that campaign in the context of your greater corporate accountability work.
Yeah, I mean, so we fundamentally believe at Color of Change that you can't advance racial justice without dealing with corporate power, and that corporate power in some ways is such a force that stands in the way. You know, I actually interviewed for our Voting While Black podcast that actually won a Webby Award for Best Political Podcast. But during my Voting While Black podcast, I interviewed each of the presidential candidates, many of them. And what we did was we had a conversation not just about the what in terms of their list of policies that they want to move, but the how. Because the thing is that far too often we'll get a list of proposals from even sort of left-leaning candidates, but they won't tell us how they're going to achieve it. And they certainly don't tell us how they're going to deal with the forces that stand in the way of the type of economic and political progress that Black people need, which is oftentimes the biggest barrier are corporations, right? You know, you can send all the water bottles to Flint that you want, but unless you're going to clean the pipes, you're not going to actually have the sort of long-term need. And the reason why they don't have clean pipes is because a tax policy that has let corporations off the hook from paying their fair share, that has put cities and communities, particularly Black cities and communities, on austerity in the richest country in the world, where many billionaires exist, but then people don't have like clean water running into their sort of houses. And that is not an unfortunate accident like a car accident. It is manufactured. And that is why corporate power is so important to us. And it's why we're the only national Black civil rights organization in the country that does not take corporate financial support. That is a very tricky decision to have sort of in any environment where you're raising money. But even as the uprisings of George Floyd happened, many big corporations were announcing these big checks to Color of Change. And I was waking up in the morning being like, well, I don't know how they're giving us this money because we don't take it. And sort of having to introduce ourselves to corporations that we had previously maybe run campaigns on, but didn't have CEO level relationships. Our relationship with Facebook is unique in that we have been back and forth with Facebook for 5 years. And in many ways we had, pushed for a civil rights audit. We had done a lot of different things that sort of helped to kind of amplify the challenges with Facebook, which in many ways started with issues around policing, the doxing of Black Lives Matter activists and people, even from law enforcement, showing up to folks' homes, which Corrine Gaines, a Black woman in Baltimore, had her Facebook Live turned off because the police asked Facebook to turn it off while she was in a police interaction. She ended up dead shortly afterwards, with police having one story and it not being sort of completely being able to back up with all the sort of visible facts. Baltimore has recently moving in, I think, to settlement of multi-million of dollars to Corrine Gaines' family. And so all of these are sort of issues of how we got into it. But in late 2018, sort of in the height of some of the back and forth we've been having after Facebook had already agreed to a civil rights audit, after they had announced it, and they announced it sort of with a conservative audit that would be done by John Kyle, a former US senator who has a history of racist and homophobic sort of work. But they once again put this idea of conservative bias, which is a tax on conservatives because of what they believe, on the same level as a tax on Black folks, LGBT, women, other racial and ethnic minorities for who they are. And they put those things on the same sort of scale because conservatives have weaponized this idea of conservative bias inside of Facebook. And that's part of the sort of really chief challenge I have with Mark Zuckerberg, is that he continues to make decisions thinking he understands civil rights, and he doesn't. He also gets to make decisions that no other sort of corporate CEO in other industries gets to make, in terms of not having the type of rules of the road and accountability for a platform and a piece of infrastructure that's so large and has so much influence. But back in 2018, it was revealed by the New York Times that while we were doing this advocacy work, that Facebook hired a PR firm to launch attacks on us. And I found out when a New York Times reporter had called me right after they posted the story. They wanted comments on it, and we had to go in and really figure that out. From that point, we moved from like mid-level conversations at Facebook to senior level conversations at Facebook. We've had a lot of back and forth, a lot of meetings. I want to be really clear. I'm at that table and trying to push for some change because we have an election coming up. Do I believe that Facebook can police themselves? No. Do I believe that the federal government is going to give us the laws right now that we need? No. And so we are in a rock in a hard place in terms of how do we push this company to do the things, or at least some of the things that might be helpful in preventing some of the type of voter suppression that we saw back in 2016 that makes it harder for my people to vote, that makes it harder for us to cast a ballot. And so in some ways, this is harm reduction work. This is the work that you have to do when you don't have all the other choices at your disposal to sort of move an agenda. But part of this Stop Hate for Profit campaign, hopefully for us, is us raising more public awareness. When you have social justice organizations working with sort of major corporations that no one would see as social justice warriors, and you have them all saying the same thing about some of the practices of this platform and how large it's gotten, right? Facebook has 2.6 billion users. That is more followers than Christianity. That means it has a single person that has 60% of the shares, that makes all of the decisions. At the end of the day, things about that have to change if we're going to get to a place where true accountability and civil rights is taken seriously. And in the meantime, we have worked to raise attention on this so that hopefully they will make some changes by the end of August around voting. They've already done some things that were connected to the demands. But back in June 1st, which was not the last meeting I had with Mark, but the second to last meeting we had over Zoom with Mark and Sheryl Sandberg and other folks, we had this meeting where we were going back and forth on the Donald Trump looters and shooters post. We were going back and forth on some posts that Donald Trump had put up around vote by mail that were clearly suppressing the vote. Each of these policies violated the four corners of Facebook's policy. Trump's post violated the policy. However, Mark Zuckerberg calls up Donald Trump and has a conversation with him about the looters and shooters post and then leaves it up. I grew up in a small town, 15%, 10% Black. I know what it means when the sort of police chief's nephew sort of violates the same rules that the Black kid down the street violates, and the Black kid goes to jail, and the police chief's kid gets nephew gets sort of like a warning or told don't do it again. I understand a world very clearly where they can have a set of written rules, but they get applied to different people differently because of who they are and their power. And so the part of the problem here on this platform is that these decisions that are being made are deeply consequential, and doesn't seem to be any sort of evaluative force to sort of monitor how it's being done. They are also just done through a deep political lens. So Mark Zuckerberg the person who sort of oversees the department that makes these decisions about political posts is a guy named Joel Kaplan. And Joel Kaplan sat behind Brett Kavanaugh in during his confirmation for the Supreme Court. Joel Kaplan was, famously in Florida during the recount for Al Gore and George W. Bush, one of those folks in the suits that were yelling about at the folks who were recounting and making sure that all the votes were actually counted. Joel Kaplan, if he were alive in the 60s, would have been part of the institutions and organizations that would have made it so that John Lewis couldn't vote. That's who Mark Zuckerberg has decided to put next to him and help him figure out voter suppression. He has put someone that has made a career out of seeing racism as not a barrier to his participation or engagement with political institutions. And this is the person that Mark and Cheryl have defended to me multiple times when I have said that he should not be involved in this work and that he should no longer be there. And so when I say these challenges at these institutions, it's that they have prioritized, elevated, and given power to people who have advanced racist causes day in and day out in their lives. And this is why we also see uprisings from staff at Facebook who understand who Joel Kaplan is. And so I want to say to the staff at Facebook who are maybe watching, we see you and we thank you, because the history of civil rights requires people on the inside exposing and pushing back as much as it does the people on the outside.
So that's I have a million follow-up questions, but I'm just going to start with at that point specifically. As I said, I'm one of your 7 million. You text, I do. You text, I filled in my census. I like you guys for that. You keep me. You keep me doing what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
In terms of tech worker uprisings, I live in a district in New York where we have just elected a social democratic state senator, for example. Mm-hmm. And part of that platform was tech accountability, specifically. And I'm wondering, does color of change, what you've just said, thank you to the tech workers, but if you are a tech worker right now watching this, what could you do or say from inside your company, outside of your company? How can you become part of this movement is one. And then the second is just to internationalize the conversation slightly. Facebook as a company has 2.6 billion. And I always tell my Facebook loving family in Zambia that we have a new Jesus. He's called Mark Zuckerberg, and he puts lots of sunscreen on while surfing. So we have that. Jesus came, he's here. Democracy. But then obviously it's not the only company, right? And all of these companies, Microsoft, IBM, all of these companies that have come out and said Black Lives Matter. And in the case of IBM and Microsoft, and always one I'm forgetting, it will come back after the interview, and I wish I would have said it, but whatever, came out, right? And said they weren't going to sell facial recognition to the police. So how can we, for viewers who don't sit in the United States, what could a color of change-esque like response be if you're sitting in Brazil and saying, hang on, we really need to do that too? Or how can they join in to this global color of change network?
Yeah. So, I think a couple of things. I do think that we have to call these companies out in very clear ways. We have to find, in some ways, the places where the decisions are made inside the companies. We have to do, we have to do the work, sort of, in my opinion, of also looking at behind the statements that they actually make. And so we'll watch where companies may say, we're not going to sell facial recognition anymore to law enforcement, but who are you going to sell it to? And will they then go sell it to law enforcement, right? We have watched the proliferation of third-party vendors, especially in the data space, sort of circumvent some of the civil rights policies and protections around how race data will be shared, and then how it will be leveraged and operationalized across housing, credit, policing, and so much more. And so this is why this has to be a rights-based movement, not just a sort of corporate accountability movement. Yes, we can make corporations better actors, and we should be exposing the atrocities, but we need to expose them as a vehicle to get better laws. And, you know, for us, I feel a deep sense of responsibility, because I recognize the outsized role that America has, the outsized role that Black civil rights can play in getting some of these companies to put in place policies that we can then use as force multipliers internationally, with the recognition that if we force a new normal here in the United States, we can use that, hopefully, as a vehicle to push elsewhere. That also has all sorts of downsides because of where our politics is right now, and all the ways in which the sort of relationship to corporate power that our government currently has. These companies, right, at the end of the day, care about growth and profit. And so as much as they will make it seem like they are sort of with us on human rights and care about LGBT folks and the climate and racial justice, we know that it's one thing to say something, it's another thing to continue to do the exact opposite. And what we consistently see over and over again is these companies making statements of support, maybe even personally, the leaders supporting the political candidate for president that I might support, but then watching them do a whole set of things that make it harder for the communities that they say they care about to exist and be heard.
Okay, that makes me feel good, and we all have our call, right? This is all of us. We all have to stand together, and I want to move kind of, as we're closing out our conversation, back to this idea of rights. So I am absolutely famous for every meeting I'm in, particularly those in the human rights community, to really balk at the idea that the human rights community cares about Black lives. And the reason that I say that is often in rights-based frameworks, we think about, we don't ever consider the humanitarian crisis of being Black in the everyday, right? We don't think about the lived experiences of being over-surveilled, being overcharged, being undereducated, and it really wasn't until the COVID crisis, at least here in the United States and in the United Kingdom, where I'm very cognizant of both those politics, where we were seeing these racial health disparities, and white people started to say, oh my goodness, Black Lives Matter, this is a problem. And my preferred frame for what I see in technology is this idea of automated anti-Blackness, right? Anti-Blackness being a theory of extreme violence being visited upon Black people just because they're Black in the most mundane circumstances. So, Breonna Taylor sing on her couch, for example. There was another young man just before her sing on her couch. My question, and I get pushback, and I love all of these conversations with my civil rights friends, and thank you, RightsCon, for inviting me, even having said that. But the one thing I will say about RightsCon as an organization is I was really impressed in their opening ceremony when their leader admitted that they didn't have this racial justice frame, and they weren't putting it to the front, that they could see the pain in Sudan, but they couldn't see the pain in Detroit, and make that connection between the way those two black communities were being treated. So I'm wondering, as you talk about moving this conversation away from corporate responsibility and moving it into a human rights frame, which is quite frankly more valuable to us, because in US civil rights law, you have to be able to prove intent to discriminate. At least in the human rights framework, we can see this idea of disparate impact, where we just look for patterns of discrimination and then we can go in. My question to you from a color of change perspective, because I see how you navigate these worlds between human rights and civil rights, what is the strategy there? And for those of us who care about Black people and care about Black people in all their intersections, disabled, gay, straight, poor, not poor, in all of those intersections, what advice would you have for us to really move this idea that it's not about companies, it's about the way we treat Black people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you said it. And I mean, I think a couple of things that I hear from that is, one, I think having the context in the country, having leaders who are indigenous to their environments at the center of this work is so critically important, because you need context. And that's where sort of from a US perspective, I kind of oftentimes see the difference between civil rights and human rights. A lot of tech companies will use frameworks around human rights to actually push back against some of the sort of civil rights protections we are demanding, because they will sort of prioritize this, I think, what is oftentimes misreading First Amendment, a misreading of freedom of speech principles to supersede sort of anti-discrimination laws, to supersede sort of other amendments, and the 65 civil rights law. And so forcing Facebook to recognize that if they're targeting marketing is excluding women from jobs or excluding Black people from housing, then that is not simply about someone's freedom of speech. That is actually violation of other laws. And you have to have a real focus. And there's always a way in which I recognize when something hits Black people in a very specific, unique way, there's a way in which there can be a reason or an excuse for not people taking it on. And I want to say this just in the context that, as we think about anti-Blackness, I think we have to just continue to interrogate both the language that we use around it and how that leads to the type of solutions that we end up with. Because oftentimes we end up starting from a place of how do we help Black people? And if we start from a place of how we help Black people, or how do we fix the problems that Black people are facing, then we are already starting from a place where we see Blackness as a deficit, and we'll never actually sort of undo all the policies and practices. And so let me just say what I mean by that. We will call Black communities vulnerable, and vulnerability is a personal trait. I can be personally vulnerable if I go on social media and I see an ex that's way too happy with their life. Like, that's something I need to work out for myself, right? Like, I don't, like, that's personal. But if we talk about Black communities as vulnerable, then we spend all of our time trying to fix Black people and Black communities rather than fixing the structures that have targeted, exploited, attacked us. And so, we will say things like Black people are less likely to get loans from a bank, instead of banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. We will say Black women are less likely to make it to the C-suite of tech companies, instead of tech companies exclude Black women from the highest levels. Right? Once again, we end up with, like in the banking scenario, we end up with financial literacy programs for Black people instead of actually fixing the systems and structures of banking, which since its very founding in this country have excluded, targeted, redlined, exploited Black people. In the tech scenario, we end up with pipeline programs, mentorship programs for Black women to help Black women somehow do better inside of a racist, exclusionary system, which has systemically excluded them from the very beginning. And so part of, I think, what I am sort of demanding from and what asking for the human rights community to recognize is that when we talk about Black people and we talk about systems that hurt us, we have to talk about the systems in active voice and Black people in passive voice, not Black people in active voice and the systems in passive voice, because it is the systems that are exploiting and targeting us. Because we are not trying to fix Black people, we are fixing and changing and dismantling the systems that have hurt and targeted us. That is how we get to justice and freedom. Because all of this work, right, at the end of the day, cannot just center Black pain, but has to also center Black brilliance, Black creativity, Black joy, which is not the absence of pain, but the presence of aspiration and the presence of what we are fighting for. All around the world, there are movements that have centered themselves and modeled themselves off of the liberatory work of Black people here in the US, off of the songs, the chants, and the work to fight for a better tomorrow and freedom. So there's nothing about that that is from a deficit perspective. There's everything about that that has actually been focused on making democracy work. Because the final thing I'll just say about it as we head into an election even, is that Black people, Black Americans, Black people in general, are the protagonists in the American story of voting. No group of people have fought harder, stood on longer lines, faced more indignities to be able to express their will for a better future. No group of people have had to face more indignities, threat of violence to be educated, just to learn how to read. If you sort of look at the history of literacy in this country and slavery and Jim Crow, all of these things have been part of the American story. So we shouldn't be starting our work thinking about how do we help and fix Black people, but how do we channel what are not unfortunate stories of injustice, but unjust stories of injustice. And how do we build the power to actually change the rules long term? And that, I think, is how we both make democracy work. And when we make democracy work, then we can build the systems and structures to make sure that technology doesn't exploit our holes in our democracy, because the water that pours over the floor will find the holes, and we have a lot of holes to fix.
Oh my God, Rashad, you have just taken me to church, full church. I appreciate you for that. I have admired your work for years because of this, and thank you for putting us in our rightful frame. I think Nicole Hannah-Jones and others are also doing incredible work around framing who we are and the contributions that we've made. So we only have 3 minutes left. Some of me wishes it was 30 minutes, but I'm tired. So I'm happy that it's 3. And my final question is really about that. So thank you for this incredible conversation. But in our email exchange prior to us speaking to each other, we actually were sharing quotes of Audre Lorde, because both of us are very, very tired. And one of the things that I would love for you to help end us on is for other Black people who are doing racial justice work in a moment where the world is looking at the fate of Black people. What advice would you have for them to take their rest and to find their joy? And that's my final question.
Yeah, I mean, I always say to my staff, I say to myself sometimes, is that this is all a short stop on a long journey. Both a short stop on a long journey in our lives, hopefully, but a short stop in a long journey on the life of Blackness and on the sort of work to dismantle systemic and structural racism. And none of this will be overturned tomorrow. There's no piece of legislation. There's no silver bullet to changing any of this. Part of this is the legacy of work that we are coming from and the legacy of work that we will pass on. But it is about, at each phase, I think, passing on something bigger, better, greater, and more open for the generation that comes behind us. And I'm talking about the generation of all races, because when we end anti-Blackness, we end so many other of the systemic harms. You know, the final thing I'll just say to the people who are doing this work is everyone's got their own thing about self-joy, about personal care and all those things. But the final thing I'll just say is that sometimes people will say, we will get racial justice and gender justice when we get a true democracy. And I say the reason why we don't have a true democracy is because we don't have racial justice and gender justice. And the norms around our democracy that sort of in its very founding prevented racial and gender justice is exactly what we need to dismantle. So the work that you are doing, if you're feeling tired and you need a break, know that it is part of a legacy of not just ensuring a couple of rights, but it's about figuring out whether or not in a multiracial society, we can build the power structures for all of us to be able to have the things that we need. And that type of work is not work that happens in a lifetime. That is work that happens across many lifetimes. And so let's get to work, but also let's recognize that we are part of it. We are not all of it.
Rashad, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the beach and I hope that you get your rest. And we appreciate you. We appreciate you. Thank you so much, RightsCon.
Thank you. Thank you.